Hello and welcome to another episode of the Total Clarity Podcast. I'm Mike Varlet.
And I'm Jessie Hyatt. And today we have our friend Tahir here with us. And I'm going to read a little bio about Tahir, and then we'll start talking. So Tahir Karmali was born in 1987 in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. He's an artist based in Brooklyn since 2014. His work spans photography, installation, papermaking, sculpture, and sound. Karmali's work was on exhibition at The Shed in New York in August of 2019, was recently the subject of a solo exhibition at Strong Room in Newburgh, New York, and will be part of Second Career's 2 tributaries in African art at the Cleveland Museum of Art from July to November 2020. His work has previously been exhibited at LKB Gallery in Hamburg and Copenhagen, Circle Art Agency in Nairobi, High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Kunsthal in Rotterdam, and Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Among others. Karmali was awarded a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant and a Lower East Side print shop keyholder residency, both from 2019 till 2020, and will be in residence at the Watermill Center in 2020. He was previously an artist in residence at Triangle Arts Association, Pioneer Works, Trestle Gallery, the McDowell Colony, and Brick. And he is an adjunct professor of sculpture at Brooklyn College. So there we have it.
Very
a
nice.
whole formal intro to
Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a great time.
That's it. Bye.
I love it, though, because it tells, that's only like your recent history and your recent resume. Mm-hmm. And you even have a resume that goes much further back. Mm-hmm. And it's impressive.
Thank you. I was very surprised that, sort of when putting it together, that, what am I saying? I was like, sort of, I've always feel it very surprising when I put my bio together and like put the whole thing together, and like, I think this one wasn't written by me, but I think that, it's always sort of like, it feels like so like a listicle or like a list sort of like situation, like reading off of the CV. And then when you hear it, because you always like, when you're writing it, you're going through it, you just like whatever, and you just send it to like whatever person. And then when you hear it, it's like, wow. I've been busy. Yeah. But, because as an artist, you always feel that you're like not really amounting to much most of the time, and you just sort of sit in the studio and be like, nobody loves me. I've never been loved in my whole life. And then it's like, the reality is that, you just try hard and then you'll get there, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, right, because you're taking it one day at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, I know you personally. We all know you personally here. And I know when I talk to you, sometimes you're always thinking like the next step, right? And so wherever you currently are is like, well, I've already gotten here. Yeah. So like, how do I move on to the next step?
Yeah.
But then when you take a step back and look over what you've already done, is it humbling, or is it like, is there a moment where you can feel some pride about yourself?
I think it goes in waves.
Okay.
There's like, it goes into, so they're like stages. So there's like, yes, you feel pride. You also feel shame. You also feel regret, and you also feel humbled. And you also feel inspired. It's a sort of like, it's more like a circle. Like, I feel like the creative sort of life cycle is this kind of circle of like, emotional turmoil, like consistent. So it's like, there's never sort of like a time where you're like, oh, that's fine, I often look back at my website, or I look at my work and look at pictures of my work and like previous shows, and you're always sort of like, oh, I wish, I'm like, but the next step is going to be good. Right. The next step is going to be better. The next step is, so you're always working on the next thing, you know what I mean? And there's like very little time to, you can't just have, I'm not one of those people that wants to just stick with one particular shtick. Right. There's always like something new. Something always looks very different from what it was before, and it's just, I feel a little bit more fun that way.
Yeah. Well, with the creative with working within a creative industry or being a creative person and having ambition and being interested in how the world changes and grows and how you change and grow, I feel like you're never like finding the final answer, right? Like, so when you look back on other things, you think, oh wow, I presented that as the answer at that time, and now I know so much more.
Well, it's the answer for that person. I mean, we're never the same person. There's this idea that because we're in the same casing, somehow we are the same the entire time, but we're not. 28-year-old you is different from 16-year-old you, is different from 35-year-old you, is different from 80-year-old you, and they all have different understandings of the truth that are objectively true.
Yeah.
And subjectively true as well. You know, that like you can make something at a certain age and it's not invalidated because you've shifted to a different, point.
Right.
I've always been very interested in sort of like this phrase where it's like, when you talk about a specific artist and it's like, oh, I really love their early work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, especially when it comes to like musicians, like their debut album or their whatever, and then, they get older and they change over time. And I think that one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like the later work is because they're kind of corrupted by this sort of like the market and the capitalist system and then sort of like reproducing something. And when I always look at my earlier work, sometimes I'm like, oh, that was kind of okay, like I would have approached that differently. But then sometimes there are like these moments where it's like, oh wow, like I thought that, like
right.
There are these kind of things where it's like, oh, like the earlier work kind of also teaches you more about yourself. I feel like the longer it's been out and stuff, and so you go into these moments of like appreciating earlier work and then sort of also despising it at the same time.
Right.
Which is kind of just like how you feel about your face, I guess.
Right. Well, there's like, I think I always really like, or not always, but I often like, and I usually will look for work from children and also work in sketchbook, which is sort of the less thought out, more naive pieces. And there's something about that's the unlearned or like the process of learning. It's really raw, and there's just this like early human quality to it. Not early human as in history, but just like the beginning phases of becoming a person.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really exciting part about life, that we all become people. So those like moments where you can see anything sort of becoming is usually my favorite part of any creative thing that I'm viewing.
I really love the unlearning process and like the learning to unlearn at the same time. And I think that it's you reminded me of this lecture by Gayatri Spivak, who teaches humanities at Columbia, and you should check it out. The lecture is called "What is the Time on the World Clock?" And so I've been like doing a lot of research recently, and so that's one of the recent lectures that I was listening to. And it's actually at the Institute of Unlearning, and she speaks about unlearning and the concepts around unlearning and what it means. And I think that especially now when we start thinking about like colonial histories, like neo-colonial activity now through sort of like capitalism, you have to be in this constant stage of like really learning something to a point that you can like dismantle and unlearn it as well. And I think that happens a lot within sort of like my practice. A lot kind of what I see the future of art really to be is this kind of like dismantling and rebuilding and unlearning, and it just has to happen sort of in this sort of like this way, you know what I mean? Yeah. And you see a lot of people, especially now with the Black Lives Matter movement, really kind of these protests and people educating themselves and like really learning a lot about American history, and starting to sort of like unlearn what they were taught in high school or whatever in terms of what they knew about history, and start to kind of like relearn and kind of, you know, reconfigure their perceptions around, you know, these invisible borders that we face every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely been going through that, and I actually hadn't really thought about it as learning to unlearn. I'm glad you said it that way, because I've been referencing it as cognitive dissonance, which I guess it's kind of like it's happening all at the same time, where I'll learn one thing and it is exactly the opposite of something that I always thought I knew. And so they fight against each other in my head. And it's exciting, it's scary and it's confusing, but it's also an exciting thing to realize that I'm going more towards the truth and I am able to break down things that I always just sort of took for granted or were taught and either are incorrect or just don't tell the full story.
And I think it's nice because, like, you know, we work like primarily with like material and process. So to see that happen with materials and to use materials to sort of like, you know, create this sort of, you know, like I think a good example of this is like with the strata work, this sort of, you know, we did that together.
Will you talk a little bit about what it is for the people that aren't here?
Right. So it's, I mean, like the dismantling of like the cell phone battery and like understanding the origin of these materials that come from the battery, right? And sort of like you're immediately sort of like taking something that we kind of understand, especially in the West, as this sort of like ubiquitous object of like this cell phone, which kind of like constantly kind of reflects this perceived, you know, bubble that we live in. But when you start to dismantle it and understand where all the different aspects and different pieces of it like actually come from, one of which is cobalt, which is a great sort of material for pigmenting, and also copper, and then dismantling that battery, extracting the cobalt, and then oxidizing and turning it into sort of like a dye almost. Is it a substrate dye? What kind of dye would that be?
Well, it's a dye that doesn't quite, it's not like
It's a metallic dye.
fully permanent. It is a metallic dye.
Yeah. I don't know what it, I get very concerned about it. Like,
I guess it could be like just a pigment.
Yeah.
Also.
It is a pigment, right? Versus actually being a full-on, I mean, I
think I would call it like an earth mineral pigment.
An earth mineral, I mean, they are earth minerals.
Yeah.
And sort of like using a material like raffia, which is something that a lot of people aren't really used to sort of in the West, and sort of like pairing these kind of materials, both of which are kind of from Central Africa, like the Congo, to kind of discuss kind of like the realities of like mining and like what, you know, these histories are. But it's sort of this notion of like, you know, the phone itself, you know, coming in this very clean, sleek box, and it almost feels like, you know, Apple branded, or all this, it almost feels good for you, you know, like everything clean. It looks like you. It reflects you. But once you actually really get to the core of dismantling what it is, and the further you start to understand its history, the history of those materials, you know, the more you actually learn about how the world works, and it has to come from, you know, dismantling those ideas, both physically and cognitively.
Yeah. If the viewer can infer from our conversations thus far, Jesse and Tahir have collaborated a number of times on projects, principally imagined initially by Tahir, but ultimately through collaboration become joint projects.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because Tahir has an amazing sense for these things, and the way that you think about everything has always inspired me. And I love working with material.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's always a pleasure to work with Tahir.
I think it's like also we operate on a very similar language that makes it easier for us to collaborate. You know what I mean? Like if somebody was to watch us talk about how those things are needing to be made, I don't think anybody would understand what we're talking about.
That might be true.
Because like if you read through the notes of like the dye patterns from the last project, it's like, what does that mean?
Especially when you started giving them like really fun names.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it has to happen like that because there's like a dialogue that happens like between us.
And I think that happens in most collaborations.
Yeah.
You sort of build a language because especially when it is something that's conceptual and is going from the mind to a physical piece, you can't really just draw it out or put it on the computer and make a model, right? It has to be like a language that's then coming into the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's important to kind of get on a wavelength together.
I feel, it's true. I feel like from my experience, like working in like marketing or working in like all these different, you've worked in creative, Michael, like for a while now. And I think what I learned from the corporate environment and what I didn't like is sort of like the suffocation of the artist and the artisan really does not give you like a good, you lose like that in, that the first draft for me is always sort of something that is so like lovely and inspiring. And while it can be refined and can be like what, I really like I like to call it like the premier cru, which is like the first, when you push the grapes down, it's like the first juice that comes out from the grapes.
Yeah, the urgency or the inspiration.
Yeah, and I like that. And I think that comes from like not suffocating, the other artists that you're working with, especially if you're like managing a project or anything like that, because then you lose the urgency, and then there'll be like all this pushback, and then there's like resentment comes in at some point, and then it's kind of like that difference between like eating a happy animal and eating like one that's been like oppressed inside a tiny cage,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, with the idea of being in a corporate environment, which comes with so many connotations, but just the idea of having a cluster of people working on something at the same time, it becomes the challenge of the management to come up with consistent ways to make that sense of urgency and have that feeling of newness appear routinely, and also know when to pull back from the refinement that will make the urgency go away. And just continually finding new tiers of where the urgency that you initially had in the first version still is retained somehow, but it's part of this larger tapestry of things that are created. When you're working on something for 3 or 4 years, it's very difficult to just have pure urgency.
Yeah. It's really hard. You have to like foster a very sort of like supportive environment, I guess, and like a positive, critical back and forth. What I think is kind of risky, I think, like with what Jesse and I do, is that we don't have that much of, there's no Control Z like option.
Right, yeah, not really, yeah.
We can't like undo what we've done. So it's sort of like you have, whatever comes out has to, while like the entire process is completely like, pre-contrived and contrived as to like how what everything means, everything happens. It's sort of like, you need to leave the gaps for the spontaneity.
Yeah, it's like, everything then, it just means that everything has to be done with a steady hand and an embrace of the mistakes.
Yeah.
So it's a balance.
It is a balance.
It's like accepting the mistakes, but also, the steady hand of like patience and setting enough time to do it with intention. which is beautiful because then it means that every single piece has that full energy of us in it.
Mm-hmm. I think when I design like the next iteration of sculptures that I'm designing right now and putting together, there are these kind of like, and especially because we're using silk, and it's a protein fiber, and that's going to be really fun to work with. But how I'm designing it right now, like the things that are being controlled are definitely the steel and the concrete and the wood and all that kind of stuff. But then there's always these gaps that I leave open for like where the silk can actually self-express, and especially how the dye will like move between it. And I think it's really important because, you know, you want to have the viewer to, while you're speaking about very intense, like impactful, like not impactful, but I mean like intense like topics, you want the viewer also to be allowed to get lost in the artistry of things,
right?
You know, and it's just like the delivery of like how you know, give a message versus just sort of being grim all the time.
Well, it makes it a little more palatable too, right?
Yeah.
Like it balances, you see something beautiful and you want to engage with it and you want to learn more about it, and you're already sort of on this elevated level of joy.
Yeah.
Because the visuals are getting you there, right?
Yeah.
But then once you start engaging with it and you understand sort of why it was created and what the full story is, even if it's, and most of your work has a sort of darker story to why you make it.
Yeah.
But it sort of, it invites you in and allows, I hope it allows people to think critically and sort of feel safe because there's this other beauty that you can experience as well with it. Is that something you think about a lot?
Yeah, I was once told by this gallery owner, this is like more to do with like the paper series, which is sort of made from my immigration documents, and it's about sort of like borders and control and sort of like the stratification of like countries and sort of upward or downward, like perceived upward or downward, like nationality, like rankings and so on. And she was like, you know, your work is too like light and it's too beautiful for, and I was like, well, I don't really think it's like that, like it's not like that aesthetically amazing, like it's fine, but like she was like, you know, you're from Africa, you need to like, it needs to be like really like dark and emotional, and like, you know, this is a really serious topic, and you know, it needs to like have this like weight and severity to it. And like the paperwork series is like only like white sheets of paper, and it's just these very sort of like you know, nuanced sort of like textural details, and also like the screen and how it kind of like filters through everything, and you know it. And I think that that's sort of like, you know, that stereotype that you have to sort of like work against. And every time when she told me that, I was like, no, I am gonna do what I want.
Yeah.
And you suck. And whatever, you know, which I would advise as a young artist to not like attack gallery owners.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I guess that's like, I guess she's seen that already, what she was suggesting to you, and what you were showing is not something she's seen, which I would think would actually be better, you know, like if you want to have a gallery and you want to have an interesting gallery that shows new artwork that's not like what we've already seen before. Yeah. I would want something that's different and fresh and looking at it from a different perspective.
I mean,
but
you'd think so.
That's not really how it is, right?
I can't tell you how many times I've seen like the same painting or the same thing over and over. I think that the art world itself is sort of like this. You have to be a successful artist. You have to have this sort of like constrained like newness. Like it's this, you know, it has to be like new but like oddly familiar, right? And so especially when it comes to sort of like negotiations around Africa and talking about Africa, people still want, you know, the heart of darkness. They still want like that entire sort of like rhetoric. They don't necessarily want like a conceptual artist that's making commentary about like, you know, late stage capitalism and neo-colonialism on a global scale. But like they're more interested in like, you know, tell me like your struggles, you know, like give me your like saddest Africa face and like put that on a canvas and then we can sell it to like some dude in like Wisconsin for some reason is coming to my head. I don't know why. Is Wisconsin nice? I've never been there.
I mean, I've been there.
It's nice.
It's pretty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah.
It's very very classic, like North Midwest.
Yeah. Well,
Pretty.
I'd say Silicon Valley because like people in Silicon Valley like love that. They love their like look how like woke we are. We have all of this like tribal stolen African art, and we have like also like like completely don't know where or what all of these objects actually mean. And then they have like, look at this painting that I have of like an African person or like a whatever, and it's this sort of virtue signal that's like works really well within like, you know, a VC, a venture capitalist like Monterey, Palo Alto home. I'm very cynical.